Welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz. I'm Marty Lasden, and I'm speaking to you from the studios of KMVT in Mountain View, California, where we are joined this morning by a young man who I think it's fair to say has triggered quite a firestorm. His name is James Damore, and earlier this month he was fired from his job as a software engineer at Google after writing a memo that went viral. That memo, which is now being referred to in the press as a manifesto, suggested that inherent biological differences have something to do with why women are consistently underrepresented in high-tech jobs. James Damore, welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I have a lot of substantive questions to ask you about your memo, but before I get to those questions, I want to engage with you a little bit on a man-to-man basis. You're, how old are you now? You're 28?
Yeah.
So that means, shockingly enough, that I'm old enough to be your father. So let's imagine for a moment that I am your father, and you have just told me that earlier this morning you were fired from your dream job at Google because of a memo that you wrote, which has left you open to the charge that you are some sort of misogynistic right-wing nut. Now, I'm your dad, so I know that's not true, but truth is not the issue here. The issue here is that you have flushed down the toilet a very promising career. And I have to say that, again, if I were your father, I would be very tempted at this point to hit you over the head with a frozen chicken. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?
Yeah, my parents were definitely disappointed in how things ended up, but...
Disappointed? Is that an understatement?
Well, they were actually very supportive, though, of me, and they understood why I did what I did, and they really commended me for having the bravery to stand up for what I believed in.
So help me understand why you felt you needed to do what you did.
Yeah, so I've attended many of these diversity programs at Google, and they actually asked for their feedback. So I wrote this document to actually give as feedback to the programs, but they read it but just completely ignored it. And then I had multiple conversations with the programs and sent it again, and they've just completely ignored it. And I didn't know if my document was consistent with everything that I had seen online and what I've been thinking about for a while. So I decided, okay, maybe I'm just in some sort of echo chamber and I don't fully understand things. So I sent it to this email list called Skeptics, and I asked basically, here's my document on Google's ideological echo chamber. What do you think? Am I right, or am I just in my own echo chamber? And then it exploded from there.
Okay, so knowing what you know now, if you had it to do over, would you write that memo again?
I would probably write it again. I would maybe...
You would?
I would maybe push harder on the diversity programs, just...
Would you write it again if you knew it was going to go viral?
I would obviously change some things.
Would you write it again if you knew you were going to be fired?
It's really hard to regret anything because
sure,
I do
it's really
think...
easy for me, but it's hard for you to regret?
Yeah, just because I do believe that what I wrote was the truth and that I'm really trying to change Google's culture, and it has brought to light a lot of issues that many people felt like they couldn't bring up. So, I think that it'll actually end up being a good, even if it hurt me.
I've read your memo 3 times, and I've seen you being interviewed on a number of occasions over the past couple of weeks, and I do want you to know there is at least one sentiment that you repeatedly express that I completely agree with, and that is that the shibboleths that are so often repeated on the left can be just as mindless and mind-numbing as the shibboleths that are repeated on the right. And you do present yourself as a young man who's done a lot of reading and thinking about these gender questions. So if the question is, why are women consistently underrepresented in these high-tech jobs, what in a nutshell is your response? What is your answer?
So I mean, obviously there may be some social factors, but which is what Google talks about all the time. And this document was really trying to express the other perspective that is silenced. And so the largest factor is the differing interest in people versus things, or empathizing versus systemizing.
And you think there's a biological substrate to some of that?
Yeah, so this is a link to prenatal testosterone.
Yeah.
So there are actually women that have just as much prenatal testosterone as men, and then they actually act more like men than they do females. So, there's a strong tie between this, and then also between that and prenatal testosterone, and also between that and career choice.
All right, so you write in your memo, quote, differences in traits between men and women may in part explain why we don't have 50% of women in tech and leadership. So right now at Google, it's my understanding that 20% of Google's tech jobs are held by women.
Right.
That means that for every one woman that's in tech at Google, there are 5 men.
Or 4.
4. See, my math sucks. Okay, 4. Okay, so that means that women have a long way to go before they get anywhere close to where they're going to have as many tech jobs at Google as men. Correct?
Right.
So when you look at the gap that exists, how much of that, what percentage of that gap do you think can be reasonably attributed to the presence or lack of prenatal testosterone?
So, I mean, it's hard to give exact numbers.
Give a rough number. 50% of that gap?
I
80%?
I think probably more than 50%.
More than 50%?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the interest in people versus things, only 15% of women have the same interest as the average male. So there's a huge gap in that, and the proportional gap only increases as the obsession over systems and things in general increases.
But it's interesting, when you look at the percentage of women in computer programming, it depends very much on both when and where you look. I don't know if you knew this, but in Denmark, in 1996, I found that women held only 6% of that country's computer programming jobs, while in Malaysia, in 1991, women held 55% of those jobs. And also, as I'm sure you know, back in the 50s and 60s in this country, computer programming departments were almost entirely dominated by women. And that it wasn't until these jobs became more prestigious and lucrative that women were effectively squeezed out. So doesn't that all suggest that biology has virtually nothing to do with the underrepresentation that we're seeing today?
No, so there's many explanations for that. So in the past, coding was very different than what it is now. It was much more like accounting. And so that is in part why we saw proportionally more computer science majors that were female in the 80s and before that. And also, when we look at different countries, it's the more gender egalitarian countries, so where we actually treat men and women the same, we see even larger gaps. And so Malaysia is not a very gender egalitarian country. And it's also a country where many people are just trying to struggle to find a job. And so they'll take whatever will pay them. While in Denmark and a lot of the Nordic countries, they'll actually just pursue whatever is they're most passionate about. And it just so happens that more women are passionate about people-oriented jobs like teaching and nursing and veterinarians, but more men are passionate about these system-oriented jobs.
But none of that, all of that, those statistics that I just read out to you, they don't in any way support that biology is the explanation for why we're seeing so many or so few programmers.
No, so they do, because so there's the second part that also contributes is men's higher drive for status. So there will be men that just sacrifice everything and work 80 hours a week for a job.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously some women do this too, but just higher proportion of men do that.
Yeah.
And so when we saw a lot of these booms in tech, that's when we saw large increases of male representation.
By the way, it's my understanding that the percentage of blacks who have tech jobs at Google is just 1%. Just 1%. What do you make of that statistic?
So there are a lot of cultural influences that I don't fully understand or know, but and just socioeconomic differences between different ethnicities that contribute to that. So there are just fewer in the pipeline in computer science programs, and so it's harder to find parallels between disparities in ethnicities and disparities in gender.
When I was a journalist many, many years ago, in fact, I was around your age, I interviewed William Shockley. Do you know who he was?
No.
He won a Nobel Prize in physics for leading the team at Bell Labs that invented the transistor. He also happened to be a guy who believed that blacks were genetically inferior to whites when it came to intelligence. And when I interviewed him at his office at Stanford University, he inundated me with all of these empirical studies, which he said showed beyond a reasonable doubt that he was right. So just as you believe that biology has something to do with the underrepresentation of women in high tech, do you think it's at least as plausible that biology has something to do with the underrepresentation of blacks in these jobs?
So I really can't talk on the biological difference between ethnicities because I honestly don't know anything about that, and that's a very touchy subject. So
well, you've been dealing with a very touchy subject with regards to women. Why is your biological analysis of women any more plausible than this Nobel Prize winner's assessment of the biological differences between blacks and whites?
Because we have a very clear link between prenatal testosterone and differing interests in people versus things.
But again, William Shockley believed he had the data to show that the link was
there's not really a clear link.
Was valid.
There's not a clear link, and there's no hormonal difference necessarily between different ethnicities.
Yeah. Going back to your manifesto, you write, "I strongly believe in gender and racial diversity, and I think we should strive for more." I'm curious, why do you think we should strive for more gender and racial diversity?
Well, so I mean, there are problems with, for example, being a minority within a company, and so that's one issue that we would likely try to fix. And also, just there is the idea that we should have some sort of proportionality in the people that test and design the products, but that.
Why?
So, at least for the testing and designing of products, if there may be some things that are specific to women and women's experience that men just don't know as much about.
So you think there should be more diversity, but then you object to just about everything that Google has done so far to promote diversity, and that includes mentoring programs, and it includes setting diversity goals for managers, correct?
Yeah, so I simply disagree with the method in which we're going about these things. So a lot of these diversity goals where you're actually incentivizing individual managers to increase the diversity of their team, that will likely impart or cause them to just look at someone's race or gender and really just identify them as a woman or as a black person, and that'll actually increase the tensions between these different groups.
So Google has something called Computer Science Summer Institute. It's a 3-week program for high school students that's largely aimed at underrepresented groups. You don't like that?
So yeah, I think just a lot of these very exclusive programs
like this, you don't like that one?
I mean, obviously, providing resources to people is good, but I think that we can do it better if we make it more inclusive. And there's a lot of people that are, for example, those that just are slightly poorer, and they would benefit from a lot of these programs too.
What about Google's BOLD program, which stands for Build Opportunities for Leadership Development? This is a program for undergrad seniors, again, largely aimed at underrepresented groups.
Yeah, again, I think that it would benefit everyone if they were more inclusive.
What about Googler in Residence? This is a program where the company sends engineers to teach at historically black colleges. You don't like that one either?
So I think us just helping people in general and not concentrating so much on people's race would be the better option.
So James, if you eliminate all those programs, how likely is it, do you think, that Google could make any progress in increasing diversity in the workplace?
I think there are many things that we can do to simply make Google a more inclusive place, and then that itself would increase the diversity. And there are many issues currently that are hurting our inclusivity.
You say that Google's efforts to increase gender and racial diversity have actually hurt the company. And you say that one possible manifestation of that harm is that these efforts lower the bar for diversity candidates. So when women and minority employees read that, can you understand why they would feel more than just a bit insulted?
So I was simply stating that there are certain practices that we have that do effectively lower the bar.
So doesn't that strongly imply that there are people at Google who have benefited from these programs who don't deserve to be there?
I wouldn't say that they don't deserve to be there, but we really should rethink these programs. And I mean, I was pointing out actual instances of bias within our culture, and that's something that our code of conduct strongly encourages, to find ways in which there is bias within our culture and fix that.
But you're a logical person. I mean, do you think it would be outrageous for someone to read what you just said about lowering the bar and not interpret that as a slam, that it doesn't imply that there are people at Google who don't deserve to be there? Isn't that an implication of what you're saying?
I'm not sure. I mean, there are many programs within Google that say exactly the opposite, that white men and Asian men are given an easier pass to get into Google. And so it's saying exactly the same thing, but reversed. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy in saying that I'm advancing harmful stereotypes and I'm hurting people, when really we have official Google programs that are saying the exact same thing, but just reversed. And so no one is really approaching them and saying, oh, don't you think that this is hurting morale and actually decreasing inclusivity?
So if the question is, are there people at Google that shouldn't be there who are there only because of these diversity programs, your answer is what?
I obviously can't say anything about an individual, but there are certain practices.
But are there people there? No, I'm not asking you to name names. But if you're right, if in fact these programs are lowering the bar, then it seems only logical that there are people there who shouldn't be there.
Shouldn't be there is more
who are not
subjective.
Qualified to be there.
Everyone at Google is highly qualified. So
everyone. So these diversity programs aren't a problem.
Well, so there may be some people that are less qualified than others, yes.
So apart from biology, this controversy is, as much as anything else, about your right to express your views without being fired. And to be fair, there are well-respected pundits who have editorialized that you should not have been fired. Clarence Page at the Chicago Tribune is one such editorial writer. David Brooks at the New York Times is another. But you know, that said, when you're working at a company with all sorts of different people, you understand, don't you, that your right to offend is not unlimited. You get that, don't you? I mean, at some point, your right to offend is trumped by another person's right not to be offended. Is that a reasonable proposition?
I honestly don't really know.
I mean, just take a hypothetical. Let's say you're a manager, and one of your subordinates is an anti-Semitic idiot, and he believes that Jews should not be hired, or that they're too untrustworthy to do business with. As a manager, you can't be reasonably expected to let this guy spout off,
Yeah. So, but I think that's definitely that's a false analogy, because
that's an extreme example.
Yeah,
but you acknowledge that you just can't let a guy like that just spout off.
Right, and I wasn't just spouting off. This was spread virally without my consent within the company.
The point is, where do you draw the line, right? In any particular case. And in your case, the CEO of Google tried to articulate where the line should be drawn in a memo that he wrote after you were fired. The CEO of Google said, quote, "People must feel free to express dissent, but to suggest that a group of our colleagues have traits that make them less biologically suited to do their jobs is offensive and not okay." And your response to him is what?
I never said anything about our colleagues. I was simply stating that in the population, there may be fewer women that actually want to work in tech. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding and just shaming that's happened with this document. And to go back to the offense thing, it's to say that you can't say anything if it offends people is really saying that you can't dissent ever, because we have certain moral biases, and those influence a lot of our thinking. And what I was saying was basically counter to the progressive ideology. So once you say anything that's counter to that ideology, that will offend anyone that holds those beliefs.
Let me read again what the CEO of Google said, Sundar Pichai. He said, "People must feel free to express dissent." He agrees with you. But this is where he draws the line.
Yeah, but I never suggested...
Let me just finish. But to suggest that a group of our colleagues have traits that make them less biologically suited to do their jobs is offensive and not okay.
I never said that anything applied to my colleagues. I simply said in the population in general.
Well, your colleagues are part of the population.
Yeah, but they're a self-selected part, and that's why we have only 20% females, because only those that are interested in tech actually come here. So, I mean, to say that saying something about the population says something about a self-selected group is...
But you want to see more than 20% at Google, more than 20% women.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure.
But you don't think it's reasonable to expect that there could be more than 20%, or do you?
No, I mean, there may very well be that...
You don't think it's reasonable to expect 50-50?
Right.
So what is a reasonable goal? Oh, but you don't believe in goals.
What do you mean? I don't believe that we should be incentivizing people to choose certain candidates just based on their race or gender. That is racism and sexism.
From the empirical studies that you've seen, you are convinced that men as a group are more thing-oriented and women are more people-oriented.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
And that's not a controversial statement.
Right, and that one consequence of that is that women are more cooperative. Is that you said that in the memo.
The higher empathizing and higher agreeableness, yes.
So let me ask you this. You were a senior software engineer at Google. Would you say that the ability to cooperate, the ability to empathize with people, would you say that those skills were unimportant?
No, they're important. And I actually suggested ways in which we could increase women's representation within Google without actual discrimination, by making tech make these traits more applicable to tech. Because currently, we don't really test for those traits within the interview or within computer science classes.
Yeah. Well, you talk about redesigning some jobs, right?
Right.
But then you also warn against arbitrary manipulation of these jobs to make them more attractive to women, right?
Right. So
aren't those two statements at odds with one another?
No. So I'm saying we could try to make Google better and take diversity as a component of Google, but just making arbitrary social engineering just to make it 50-50, that's what I disagree with. But if we do social engineering that is actually positive for Google, then that's a net positive.
Let me read to you what Jonathan Zunger has to say about what it takes to be a successful programmer. He was a senior person at Google, and in response to your memo, he wrote his own memo, and he wrote, quote, "Essentially, engineering is all about cooperation, collaboration, and empathy for both your colleagues and your customers." He added, "Solitary work is something that only happens at the most junior levels, and even then it's only possible because someone senior to you, most likely your manager, has been putting in long hours to build up the social structures in your group that let you focus on code." Is he right about that?
So yeah, I would never disagree that cooperation is important and that empathy is important in person-to-person interactions. And it's not as if the men at Google don't have these traits at all, or the women, but I'm simply stating that being able to construct and analyze systems is essentially what coding is. And the ability to just apply logic within your head, that is what systemizing is. And so to say that, oh yes, because there is also communicating with other people, which is a general trait that most people have, doesn't mean that empathy is more important than systemizing at software engineering.
But you know, when you're a manager, it occurs to me you're managing people, not things.
Sure.
Correct? So, you know, in these senior management positions, people skills are really super important, right?
Sure.
So, you know, if you're right, if men are more thing-oriented and women are more people-oriented, then it seems to me that only strengthens the case that the only reason we're not seeing more women in senior level positions managing companies, managing programmers, is because of sexism.
No, so
are you strengthening that argument?
No, there are many reasons why we don't see as many women in high-level positions. So the drive for status, for example, yes, there are many women in mid-level managing, but to go from that to CEO requires a huge amount of self-sacrifice, and many people just aren't willing to do that. I wouldn't be willing to do that. You have to pretty much sacrifice a lot of the rest of your life for the sake of your career. And you know, it's good that people don't want to do that. That you know, you want a good life.
So you think that the glass ceiling, the bro culture, the sexism, you don't think those are significant factors that account for why we're not seeing more female senior managers in corporate America?
It's hard to say which influence is stronger, but we need to acknowledge that there is another side to it, which we're not. And Google is making explicit that is simply forbidden knowledge that we can't use.
But this other side, how significant? I mean, it comes down to, you know, how significant each of these factors are. You're talking biology, the presence or absence of prenatal testosterone, but then there are, you know, glass ceilings and bro cultures that people talk about. What do you think which, you know, when you have to choose, what are the more significant factors? Is your answer that biology is more significant than those other things?
At least in this case, yeah, I think so.
On what basis do you say that?
Because we haven't really been able to measure much of this supposed sexism, and much of the sexism against men just simply isn't looked for. And so a lot of the social sciences is very biased. I mean, 95% lean left, which creates a huge confirmation bias and changes what they look for. They don't even look for the ways in which men are biased against in the workplace. And there are many, but these studies just have a narrative that once someone suggests something different, they just condemn them as evil.
What do you make of all the studies that have been done that show that compared to companies that have fewer women in senior management positions, companies that have more women in senior management positions do much better?
So yeah, these studies are all correlation and not causation. So it's really hard to say what's causing that. And to have the type of culture that would allow that changes a lot of things. And these are companies within different even sectors. So it's really hard to say what exactly is causing this.
What do you make of the news that 60 current and former Google employees may soon be filing a class action suit against Google alleging sexism and pay disparities, which, by the way, if filed, would build on allegations that the U.S. Department of Labor has already made against Google?
So Google's internal studies have consistently shown throughout the years that there is no gender disparity once you control for performance. So I don't think that there's really a base for these
So
claims.
you believe Google's senior managers when they say that those allegations are not true?
Yeah, you have to believe someone, and they have been doing this analysis.
Well, these are the same managers that say that you, James Damore, violated the company's code of conduct, a charge that you vehemently deny. So why would you, of all people, believe Google senior managers about anything?
Because they have been doing this analysis. So I don't know, and it's not as if individual managers get to choose the salary of their employees. It's much a higher level decision. So I don't know why they would be doing this analysis and then deciding to instead pay men higher. Paying women less just doesn't make sense, because if companies paid women less, then they would just hire all women because it would be cheaper. So this whole gender wage gap is largely a myth.
Politically speaking, you describe yourself neither as a liberal or a conservative. You say you're a centrist. So I'm wondering if you're at all uncomfortable with the fact that so many alt-right folks are now hailing you as some sort of hero.
So I think, first, many people in the media label people as alt-right, like Jordan Peterson, when he is very much just a classical liberal centrist. So to say that these people are alt-right is really a misclassification and just smearing me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm attacking a progressive ideological echo chamber, and so anyone that disagrees with that would support me. But I've also said that I would disagree with a conservative echo chamber. I wouldn't want to live in an Islamic state that just kills apostates and doesn't provide gay rights. So it was simply in the environment that I was in that I was attacking one side,
mm-hmm.
but I am still very much a centrist.
Yeah. When you worked at Google, you're the guy who you reported to. It was a man, right?
Sure.
Did it ever occur to you that if your boss was a woman and had the people skills that are more strongly identified with women, that perhaps you would have been treated more fairly, and perhaps you might still be at Google right now?
And the decision to fire me wasn't my manager's. It came from the top.
Okay.
It was a huge PR decision, so it wasn't his decision.
Whose decision was it?
Sundar made the decision.
A guy.
Sure.
Do you think you might have had a better shot with the CEO as a woman?
He consulted with many people, many of which were likely women, so it's hard to say.
So, last question. There have been reports in the press that Julian Assange at WikiLeaks has offered you a job. Is that true? And if it is, are you inclined to take it?
So he made a public post, but no one has ever privately contacted me about this. And I don't really even know what that job would be. I haven't followed up with this at all.
All right. Well, James Damore, thanks so much for dropping in. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.